The storm was fierce that night. Thick clouds covered the sky, and lightning crackled in the air. A sudden flash of light cut through the dark, followed by a thunderous crash that shook the earth. Ethan Blake, an ex-soldier who now lived in the isolated wilderness of Earth's forests, was hunting when he heard the sound. At first he thought it was just another storm, but the rumble felt different, like something much bigger had hit the ground. His instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. He grabbed his rifle and silently moved towards the source of the noise, his boots barely making a sound as he crept through the dense underbrush. The trees parted to reveal a clearing, and there, lying in the middle of a large crater, was a wrecked spaceship. Smoke rose from the shattered hull, and sparks flickered from the metal. It looked like a starship, not one made by humans. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. There was no way that was a human craft. He had seen the destruction alien ships could cause during the wars. This one, though, was different, sleek and advanced, with glowing markings all over its surface, as if it was alive. He approached cautiously, his hand on the trigger, ready for anything. He had learned the hard way that nothing in the galaxy could be trusted. As he neared the ship, he heard a faint sound, a soft groan, like someone in pain. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He was trained to fight, but the sight of a crashed alien ship on Earth was something else. What if they had come to finish the job? To wipe out the remnants of humanity? He followed the sound and found her. A woman. She was lying on the ground, covered in dirt and blood, but despite her injuries, she was alive. Her skin shimmered in the light, a mix of colors that he had never seen before, glowing green, blue, and purple, like some kind of strange living crystal. Her eyes, though, were the most captivating feature. They were a deep shade of violet, full of fear and desperation. The woman's clothes were torn, revealing strange markings across her body, as if they were tattoos or perhaps some form of armor. She was holding something tightly in her hand, an object that seemed to pulse with energy. The glow was faint but enough to catch Ethan's attention. He couldn't make out what it was, but it didn't look like anything from Earth. She saw him standing there, and her eyes widened in fear. She tried to move but groaned in pain. "Please," she whispered weakly. "Help me." Ethan hesitated, his instincts telling him to be cautious. He had no idea who this woman was, where she came from, or why she was on Earth. His mind raced with questions, but his soldier's instincts kicked in. He knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Stay still," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're injured. I can help." "Please," she gasped, her voice trembling. "They're coming. They'll kill us both." Ethan's eyes scanned the wreckage of the ship, looking for any signs of attackers. His years of training had taught him to be aware of every danger. The feeling of being watched crawled up his spine. He knew this wasn't just a random crash. Something or someone was hunting her. He gently lifted her into his arms, ignoring the pounding in his chest. "Who's coming? Who's after you?" "They are," she whispered, her breath shallow. "The Zarkan Empire. They'll do anything to capture me." Her voice was barely audible, but the fear in her eyes spoke volumes. She was no ordinary woman. She was running from something terrifying. The hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stood up. He had heard of the Zarkan Empire, an ancient, tyrannical alien force that had conquered countless worlds. They were ruthless, using advanced technology to crush anyone who stood in their way. Ethan had fought in the wars, seen the devastation they caused, and he had lost comrades to them. If this woman was right, then Earth was in grave danger. Just then, a soft hum reached his ears. He froze. The sound was faint but unmistakable. The woman in his arms stiffened. "They found us," she whispered in panic. "We don't have much time." Ethan's eyes scanned the horizon. He saw nothing. No ships in the sky, no movement in the forest, yet he felt it. The ground beneath him seemed to vibrate with energy, and the trees shook slightly. His instincts screamed that they were being hunted. There was no way to outrun whatever was coming. Suddenly, The air crackled with energy. A sleek black craft appeared from nowhere, cloaked against the sky. The stealth ship was almost invisible, but its red and green lights flickered briefly, revealing its location. Ethan cursed under his breath. They had found them. The woman in his arms gasped. "We have to go. They'll kill you too." Her eyes filled with fear, but there was something else there. Something more desperate, almost pleading. "Please, you don't know what they'll do to you. You have to leave me." Ethan shook his head. There was no way he was leaving her. He had seen too much violence in his life to turn his back on someone who needed help. "I'm not leaving you. We fight together." Before the woman could respond, a group of alien soldiers dropped from the stealth ship, their armored forms glowing with the same eerie lights as the craft. They were fast, too fast for regular humans, and they moved like shadows. Ethan's heart raced as he realized the battle was about to begin. The woman's warning had come true. They were already surrounded. Ethan dropped to the ground, pulling her behind a large boulder for cover. His mind raced. There was no way they could outrun these soldiers, but he wasn't going down without a fight. He had been trained for situations like this. "We need to move fast," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You have a plan?" The woman nodded, her expression grim. "I have something, but I'll need your help. Can you fight?" Ethan grinned grimly. "That's what I do best." Then crouched behind the boulder, listening to the faint sound of the alien soldiers moving closer. The woman in his arms was still weak, but her eyes burned with determination. He could feel her body tense as she prepared to fight, even though she was in no condition to do so. He glanced at the sleek, black craft hovering just above them, cloaked in the darkness. The Zarkan soldiers were closing in fast, their footsteps silent but deliberate. Ethan could see their glowing eyes scanning the ground, searching for any sign of movement. "We need to get out of here now," Ethan muttered, his grip tightening on his rifle. He had faced enemies in the past, human and alien, but these soldiers were different. They were fast, deadly, and equipped with technology beyond anything Earth had seen. The woman nodded weakly, but didn't say a word. Instead, she lifted her hand, revealing a small device that was now glowing faintly in the darkness. Ethan could see the power in her eyes, the same glow that had drawn him to her in the first place. But what did it do? Was it a weapon? A key to her survival? He couldn't be sure. "I can't fight like this," she whispered, her voice strained. "But I can help." Ethan's mind raced. He needed to keep her alive, and that meant figuring out how to turn the tables. He wasn't just fighting to protect her now. He was fighting for Earth. If these Zarkan soldiers were here for her, then that meant they were coming for more. Much more. He stood up suddenly, pulling her behind him. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. "I'll cover you." Without waiting for her response, Ethan sprinted toward a nearby rock formation, using his knowledge of the terrain to stay hidden. He could hear the alien soldiers getting closer, their footsteps now echoing in the night. He knew they wouldn't stay hidden for long. It wouldn't take long before they spotted him or the woman. The woman's eyes flashed. "It's too dangerous. We can't outrun them." Ethan shot her a glance. "Then we fight. You help me, and I'll protect you." Her lips tightened, but she didn't argue. She seemed to understand that this wasn't a time for hesitation. In a flash, she pressed the glowing device to her chest. It buzzed to life, and a soft, shimmering light surrounded them both. Ethan barely had time to react before he felt a strange sensation wash over him. The air around them grew colder, and the world seemed to blur for a moment. He blinked, confused, but then he realized what had happened. The woman had activated some kind of cloaking device. The Zarkan soldiers stopped in their tracks. They looked around, confused. One of them even stepped right past Ethan and the woman without noticing them. They were invisible, hidden by the device. It was like something out of a sci-fi movie. Ethan barely breathed, afraid to make a sound. "They won't be fooled for long," the woman whispered urgently. "We need to keep moving." Ethan nodded, but his thoughts were already racing. They had a brief window of time, but how much time exactly? He couldn't guess. The cloaking device wouldn't last forever, and it was only a matter of time before the alien soldiers realized something was off. But for now, they were safe, at least for the moment. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone," Ethan said firmly. "We'll make it through this. I won't let them take you." The woman gave him a weak smile, but it was laced with a quiet sadness. "You don't know who you're dealing with. They're not just soldiers. The Zarkans are an empire, a power unlike anything Earth has ever seen. If they catch me, they'll wipe out everything." Ethan clenched his jaw. "You don't get to decide that for me," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm in this now." For a moment, the woman didn't speak. Her eyes softened as she studied him. "I didn't want this. I didn't want to bring this danger to Earth," she murmured, almost to herself. "But I'm the last of my people, and I have something they need, a weapon that could destroy them." Ethan didn't need to ask more questions. The weight of her words hung in the air. Whatever this weapon was, it was important. So important that the Zarkans were willing to destroy an entire world just to get their hands on it. He knew he couldn't let that happen, not if he could stop it. "We'll figure this out," Ethan said. "But first, we need to get you to safety." The woman gave him a look that spoke volumes. She wanted to argue, to say that there was no safety for her anymore. But she didn't. She simply nodded, a silent agreement between them. With the cloaking device still active, they moved quickly through the forest, using the shadows to cover their movements. Ethan led the way, always one step ahead, while the woman followed closely behind him. Despite the chaos, there was something almost peaceful in the quiet of the forest, the only sound being their footsteps and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. Eventually, they'd reached the edge of the forest, where the trees gave way to a clearing. Ethan paused, peering into the distance. His mind was already working through escape plans, but there was no time to waste. He could see the faint glow of the Zarkan ship hovering above the treetops, and he knew they weren't far behind. "We need to move faster," Ethan said, glancing at the woman. The woman seemed to hesitate for a moment. Then she spoke in a low voice, her words tinged with regret. "I have a plan, but you're not going to like it." Ethan frowned. "What kind of plan?" She glanced up at him, her violet eyes filled with determination. "The only way to keep them from following us is to give them something else to chase. You'll have to distract them while I make the escape." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Do whatever it takes. Just get out of here. I'll hold them off." The woman's eyes softened. "You don't understand. Once you start this, you can't stop. It will cost you more than you know." Ethan met her gaze. "I don't care. Let's end this." And with that, their fates were sealed. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, his body tense and ready for whatever was coming. The woman, who had barely spoken since their narrow escape from the Zarkan soldiers, was now beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon with fear and determination. They both knew the enemy was closing in. It was only a matter of time before the cloaking device they had relied on would fade, and then the fight would begin. Ethan's hand tightened around his rifle. He was an ex-soldier, a survivor of battles that had taken him to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, but nothing had prepared him for this. These soldiers were not like any enemies he had fought before. Their armor was sleek and practically indestructible, their weapons powerful enough to tear through solid rock. And they were fast, faster than anything he had ever seen. If it came to a straight-up fight, he knew they were outmatched. But he wasn't about to let that stop him. He had promised to protect her, and that meant fighting, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. "They'll be here soon," the woman said, her voice strained as she looked at the ship hovering just beyond the tree line. "We don't have much time." Ethan didn't need to ask her how she knew. They both felt the tension in the air, the way the ground seemed to tremble under the presence of the Zarkan forces. They were getting closer, and he could already see the shadowy figures of their soldiers moving through the trees. The woman's device was still active, cloaking them from view. But for how long? Seconds? Minutes? "Do you have any more tricks up your sleeve?" Ethan asked, glancing at her, his voice low. She shook her head, the weariness in her eyes undeniable. "No, this is it. We have to make our stand here." Ethan's heart beat faster, but he didn't let the fear show. His eyes scanned the surroundings, calculating their options. There was a small hill a few hundred feet away, high enough to give him the advantage of a good firing position. But he knew that even with the high ground, taking on these soldiers would be like trying to fight a storm with nothing but a knife. "We don't have the numbers or the firepower," he muttered to himself, "but we can't let them get to you." The woman's gaze softened, but there was still a deep sadness in her eyes. "It's not just me they want. They'll kill anyone who stands in their way." Ethan clenched his jaw. He had heard of the Zarkan Empire before, an unstoppable force that had decimated whole worlds, enslaved entire civilizations, and wiped out anyone who resisted. These weren't just soldiers. They were agents of a ruthless empire, and their goal was clear. They would stop at nothing to capture the woman, no matter the cost. "We'll make them regret it," Ethan said, his voice low but full of determination. Without waiting for her response, he turned and sprinted toward the hill. The woman followed, struggling to keep up, her strength fading with each step. She wasn't a soldier, and she wasn't used to running or fighting. But she had no choice. She had to survive, and so did Earth. As they reached the top of the hill, Ethan immediately set up a perimeter. He positioned himself behind a large rock, crouching low to the ground, rifle at the ready. His eyes darted around, scanning the area for any sign of movement. He knew that once the cloaking device wore off, they would be exposed, and the Zarkans would be upon them in seconds. The woman knelt beside him, her hands shaking slightly as she activated her device once again. A soft, shimmering glow surrounded them, and they disappeared from view. Ethan's heart raced as the sound of footsteps grew louder. He could feel the Zarkan soldiers closing in, their technology too advanced for him to track by sight alone. All he could do was listen, wait for them to make their move. And then, without warning, the cloaking device flickered and died. The woman gasped, her face pale with fear. Ethan's heart dropped. They were no longer invisible. The Zarkans had already spotted them. He didn't waste any time. "Get down," he shouted, pulling her down beside him just as the first blast rang out. The air around them crackled with energy, and Ethan felt the force of the explosion as it shook the ground. The blast narrowly missed them, but the shockwave threw him off balance. He fired back, his rifle roaring to life as he aimed at the advancing soldiers. The shots rang out, but the enemy's armor absorbed the impact. They barely seemed to slow down. The Zarkans were relentless, advancing steadily, their weapons flashing with deadly precision. Ethan gritted his teeth. There was no way they could win this fight. Not like this. He took another shot, but it didn't even slow the soldiers down. His mind raced. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. They were running out of options. "Stay low," Ethan shouted as another barrage of fire rained down on them. He could feel the heat of the blasts, but he knew they couldn't stay in the open much longer. The soldiers were closing in, their weapons powered by advanced energy cells that could vaporize anything in their path. The woman was shaking now, but she wasn't giving up. She pressed the button on her device again, and this time, a faint blue glow appeared in her hand. Ethan could see the effort it took for her to activate it. Whatever she was doing, it drained her energy. She had to make it count. "They won't stop," she said, her voice tight with pain. "They'll keep coming. We need to get out of here." Ethan turned his head, his eyes scanning the surroundings. His heart pounded as the enemy closed in, but there was no retreat. He wasn't going to let them take her. "I'm not leaving you," Ethan said, his voice grim. "We fight." Suddenly, the first wave of Zarkan soldiers rushed forward, their weapons blazing. Ethan fired back, but it was clear that they were outmatched. Their armor absorbed every shot, their weapons outclassing his own. Ethan's mind raced as the enemy advanced, their footsteps thundering against the ground. The woman's face was pale, and her breath came in shallow gasps. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and out of options. The sound of their footsteps grew louder, and it was clear that they were preparing to strike the final blow. He knew that in this moment, everything would change. The air around them felt thick with tension as Ethan crouched low behind the rock, his heart pounding. The Zarkan soldiers were closing in on their position, their deadly weapons ready to fire at any moment. He could see them through his scope, 6 of them, all armed and ready for the kill. They were relentless, and no matter how many shots he took, his rifle just wasn't enough to stop them. Their armor was too strong, their weapons too advanced. Every shot Ethan fired was absorbed by their shields, leaving only a dull thud as it bounced off. Ethan's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped his rifle. He had promised to protect the woman, but with each passing second, it was becoming clearer that their situation was hopeless. If they stayed here, they would be killed. The Zarkans weren't interested in negotiating. They were here to finish the job, and nothing was going to stop them. But then, something changed. The woman, who had been quiet beside him, suddenly spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't hold them off for much longer," she said, her breath shaky. "But I can do one last thing." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "What are you talking about? What can you do?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she pressed a button on the device she had been holding. It buzzed to life, and a faint blue glow surrounded them. Ethan's eyes widened as he realized what she was doing. "This is my last chance," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's a weapon they never saw coming." Ethan's mind raced. He didn't know what the woman had activated, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was their only hope. The first Zarkan soldier stepped forward, raising his weapon. Ethan fired a shot at him, but as expected, it did nothing. The soldier raised his shield, and the blast deflected harmlessly into the air. Ethan cursed under his breath. They needed something more. They needed a way to disrupt their enemies, to get the upper hand. The woman, still weak from the earlier battle, stood up shakily, her eyes locked on the advancing soldiers. "Get ready," she said, her voice steady now, as if she had made up her mind about something. Without warning, she pressed the button on the device again. This time, the blue glow grew brighter, swirling around them like a storm. Ethan felt an unfamiliar sensation wash over him, as if the very air was changing. The ground beneath their feet began to rumble, and the air crackled with energy. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew it wasn't good for the Zarkans. The glow enveloped them completely, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. The world seemed to stop. Ethan felt his heart skip a beat as he looked around. The Zarkan soldiers were frozen in place, their bodies locked in position, unable to move. The woman had activated something, some kind of field that was scrambling their systems. But it wasn't just the soldiers who were affected. Ethan looked at his rifle and saw that the display on it was glitching, flickering erratically. The technology was being disrupted, but so was everything else. The world around them seemed to slow down, as if time itself was being bent. "What did you do?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with awe and disbelief. The woman's eyes were wide, but there was a sense of relief in them now. "I've activated a disruption field. It's messing with their technology, everything they rely on. Their weapons, their armor, their communication, everything is malfunctioning." Ethan didn't waste a second. The soldiers were frozen, their weapons useless for now. He sprang into action, moving quickly and silently. He grabbed the nearest Zarkan soldier, yanking him off his feet and slamming him into the ground. The soldier struggled, but his armor was no match for Ethan's strength now that his systems were down. Ethan looked over at the woman, who was still standing a little unsteadily, but her eyes were focused and determined. "Stay back," he called to her. "I've got this." But the woman shook her head, her lips curling into a faint smile. "No," she said, her voice full of confidence now. "You won't have to do it alone. With a swift movement, she raised her hand and pressed another button on her device. The field of disruption expanded, and the glowing blue energy surged outward. The remaining Zarkan soldiers tried to move, but they were too late. Their weapons short-circuited, their armor systems malfunctioned, and they were left vulnerable. The woman's device wasn't just a shield. It was a weapon, one powerful enough to cripple the Zarkan soldiers' advanced technology. The disruption field was a small-scale EMP, but it wasn't just disabling their equipment. It was throwing them into chaos. The soldiers were now panicking, unable to call for reinforcements, unable to fire their weapons, and unable to use their shields. Ethan wasted no time. He grabbed the nearest soldier by the arm and threw him to the ground. The soldier tried to fight back, but with his tech failing, he was no match for Ethan's raw strength. Ethan punched him in the face, knocking him out cold. Another soldier charged, but the woman, now standing tall and strong, pressed a final button on her device. A pulse of energy shot out, and the soldier froze mid-step, his body jerking as the pulse hit him. He collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Ethan looked at her in disbelief. "You just took out 3 of them with one move," he said, his voice a mix of admiration and awe. The woman's face was pale, but there was a smile on her lips. "I told you, I'm not as helpless as I look." Ethan nodded, his heart racing as the last 2 soldiers tried to regroup. But now, the odds were in their favor. The Zarkans were down, and they had no tech to rely on. Ethan and the woman moved swiftly, taking down the last 2 soldiers with ease. When the battle was over, the 2 of them stood in the midst of the fallen soldiers. Their bodies lay sprawled across the ground, their advanced armor useless now. Ethan looked at the woman, a mixture of disbelief and admiration on his face. "We did it," he said quietly, breathing a sigh of relief. The woman nodded, her eyes still scanning the area. This was just the beginning. The Zarkan Empire won't give up. They'll come back, and we'll have to be ready for them. Ethan's expression hardened. "Then we'll be ready." For the first time since they had met, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. They had turned the tables. Against all odds, they had won. But the war was far from over. Ethan's heart was still racing as he stood over the fallen Zarkan soldiers. The battle had been fast, chaotic, but in the end, they had won. The woman, whose name he had learned was Lyra, was still standing beside him, her body slightly swaying with exhaustion. But her eyes were bright, filled with determination. They had just defeated a small group of Zarkan soldiers, but Ethan knew this was only a temporary victory. The Empire would send more. There was no way they would let one of their own get away, especially not someone as important as Lyra. The look of fear that had flashed across her face earlier was still present, though she was trying to hide it. "We can't stay here," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still surging through him. He turned to Lyra, his eyes meeting hers. "They'll send more. We need to get to the ship. It's the only chance we have." Lyra nodded, but there was something different in her eyes now. A sense of finality, almost as if she had already made a decision. Ethan saw it, but he couldn't place it. Before he could ask, she spoke. "I know," she said quietly, "but there's something you need to understand, Ethan." Ethan frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "We need to move now. If we wait too long..." "I'm not coming with you," Lyra interrupted, her voice soft but firm. Ethan's eyes widened in shock. "What?" "No, you don't have a choice. We can't do this without you." She shook her head, her eyes locking onto his. "You don't understand. If we don't stop the Zarkan Empire here, they'll keep coming. It won't matter if we run. They'll track us down. They have ways of finding us, no matter where we go." She paused, as if weighing her next words. "I'm the key to all of this. They're after me because of what I know, what I can do. But if I stay with you, they'll keep hunting you, keep hurting the people you care about." Ethan stepped forward, reaching out to take her arm, his grip gentle but insistent. Lyra, you're not making sense. We're in this together now. We fight together. We survive together. I've been running from the Zarkans for years, Ethan, she said softly, her voice shaking with emotion. I can't keep dragging you into this. You've already done so much for me, more than anyone else would. But if I stay with you, I'll only bring more pain. The Zarkan Empire is relentless. I can't let them hurt you anymore. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but Lyra raised her hand to stop him. She was right. The longer she stayed with him, the more danger he was in. He had seen it in the way the Zarkans had hunted her across planets, across galaxies. They would stop at nothing to capture her, to use her for whatever cruel purpose they had in mind. And as much as he hated to admit it, Lyra was right. She was putting him in danger. She was putting everyone around her at risk. I can't lose you, Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. The thought of losing her felt like a sharp pain in his chest. She had become more than just a mission to him. She was a person, someone he cared about deeply. Lyra's eyes softened, and she stepped closer to him. You won't lose me, she said quietly, but you have to let me go. I have to do this. I'm the only one who can stop them. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to push the lump in his throat down. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was as if she was already saying goodbye. But he knew deep down that she was right. He couldn't let the Zarkans destroy everything, destroy her. She had to make this sacrifice, even if it meant leaving him behind. She took a deep breath, her expression hardening. I'm going to give you something. It's a fail-safe. It will stop the Zarkans from following you, from finding you. I don't know if it will work, but it's the only chance we have. Ethan watched in silence as Lyra pulled out a small device from her pocket. It looked like a simple chip, but there was something about it that made him uneasy. This is a memory wipe, she explained, her voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. It will erase everything the Zarkans know about me, my identity, my location, everything. Once I use it, they won't be able to trace me or track you down. Ethan's eyes widened. But if you use this, they'll think you're dead. They'll stop searching for you. Lyra nodded, her face pained. That's the idea. They'll think I'm gone. I'll be erased from their memory, and they'll have no reason to keep hunting you. You'll be safe. You'll finally be free. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. The thought of losing her, of never seeing her again, was almost too much to bear. He had just found someone he cared about, someone he would do anything to protect, and now she was asking him to let her go. I can't, he started, his voice breaking. I can't let you do this. There has to be another way. Lyra placed a hand on his cheek, her touch gentle and warm. There isn't. I've made my peace with it, Ethan. This is my choice, and I need you to make yours. Do you want to survive? Do you want to stop the Zarkans from destroying everything? He closed his eyes, his jaw clenched, fighting the tears that threatened to come. He couldn't stop her. He knew that, and deep down, he knew this was the only way to keep everyone safe. Goodbye, Ethan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Without another word, Lyra pressed the device to her wrist, and a soft pulse of light flashed from it. The glow enveloped her, and for a moment, Ethan felt as if the world was slipping away. When the light faded, Lyra was gone. Her presence, her warmth, was erased. It was as if she had never been there at all. Ethan stood frozen, his heart shattered. He had promised to protect her, but in the end, she had protected him instead. A deep ache settled in his chest as he looked around, the world suddenly feeling emptier. The fight was far from over, but one thing was clear. Lyra's sacrifice had changed everything. She had given everything for the cause, for him, for a future they might never share. But he wouldn't let her death be in vain. He would finish what they had started. For Lyra, for humanity. He would make sure the Zarkans would never win. The silence that followed Lyra's sacrifice was deafening. Ethan stood there, frozen, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. One moment, she had been right beside him, her presence a quiet comfort in the chaos. And the next, she was gone, erased, like a dream that fades away upon waking. He clenched his fists, his heart heavy with grief, but also with a renewed sense of purpose. Lyra had given everything so that humanity could survive. As the weight of her decision pressed down on him, Ethan remembered her final words. "This is your fight now." The time for running was over. The Zarkans had been hunting them for too long, and now they had one less person to track. But that didn't mean they were safe. It didn't mean the war was won. The battle for humanity's future was only just beginning. He wiped the tears from his eyes, determined not to let them fall again. There was too much at stake. They had come this far, and now he had to carry the burden of her legacy. He had to be the one to finish what they had started. With one last glance at the spot where Lyra had stood, Ethan turned and began walking toward the ship. His mind was clouded, but there was no time for grief. The Zarkan Empire was still out there, and it would take everything he had to stop them. He couldn't afford to lose anyone else. Not now. Not after everything. The journey to the ship was long, but it was uneventful. No more Zarkans had appeared. The device that Lyra had used to erase her identity had worked. The Empire thought she was dead. And for now, that meant they had a small window of safety. But Ethan knew that window wouldn't last long. The Zarkans were smart. They would catch on, and they would come after him, after Earth. The ship loomed ahead, a symbol of humanity's last hope. As he entered the cockpit, he activated the controls, preparing for takeoff. The ship hummed to life, its engines roaring to life as the ship ascended into the atmosphere. The sky outside was clear, the stars shining bright, but Ethan's mind was far from the beauty of the moment. His thoughts were consumed with the fight ahead. He looked at the map on the ship's console, scanning the nearby systems for a safe place to regroup. He needed a plan, a real plan. The Zarkans had technology far beyond humanity's, and even with their technological advantages disabled, they were still a massive threat. Ethan knew he couldn't take them on alone. He would need help. He would need allies. The first step, he decided, was to contact Earth's leaders. He had to warn them. The Zarkans were coming, and they wouldn't stop until they had conquered everything in their path. But as he began to send a transmission, a thought struck him. If the Zarkans were hunting Lyra because of what she knew, then maybe, just maybe, there was a way to use that knowledge against them. With a heavy heart, Ethan began searching through the ship's databases, looking for anything that might help him understand the Zarkans' weaknesses. After what felt like hours of digging through records and transmissions, he found something. It was a file buried deep within the archives, encrypted and nearly impossible to crack. But Ethan was determined. He wouldn't let this chance slip away. He worked through the night, breaking codes and unlocking encrypted files. The information he uncovered was eye-opening. The Zarkans had one weakness, a vulnerability in their communication network, a flaw in the very system that allowed them to coordinate their forces. If it could be exploited, it could disrupt their entire military operation. Ethan smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. This was it. This was the key to victory. But to use it, he would need to act fast. The Zarkans would have caught wind of the disruption soon enough, and they would try to fix it before it became a serious problem. As the ship entered a nearby galaxy, Ethan transmitted the information to Earth's leaders, urging them to act quickly. He knew they wouldn't be able to stop the Zarkans alone, but with this new knowledge, they had a chance. Humanity had a chance. But the fight wasn't over. The Zarkans would come, and they would come in full force. It was only a matter of time. But this time, Ethan was ready. This time, humanity wasn't going to back down. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan traveled from one system to the next, gathering intelligence, building alliances, and preparing for the final confrontation. Everywhere he went, he found people, human and alien alike, who were willing to fight. The Empire's reach was vast, but so was the will of those who stood against it. Ethan knew he couldn't do it alone. He had lost Lyra, but he hadn't lost his resolve. He had lost a friend, a comrade, but he hadn't lost his fight. With each new ally he gained, with each new battle they fought, the hope for a future free from the Zarkans grew stronger. The day of the final battle arrived faster than he had anticipated. The Zarkans had finally tracked him down, and they came in overwhelming numbers. Their ships filled the skies, blotting out the stars as they descended on Earth. Ethan stood at the front of a united army, his heart steeled for the coming storm. The final battle for humanity had begun. The first wave of Zarkan ships descended upon them, their weapons firing as they cut through the air. But humanity was ready. With the knowledge they had gained, with the weakness of the Zarkan communication network now in their hands, they were able to disrupt the enemy's coordination. The once overwhelming force of the Zarkans began to falter, their attacks disorganized and ineffective. Ethan and his team fought with everything they had, their ships weaving through the chaos as they launched counterattacks. The sky was alive with energy, explosions lighting up the darkness. Ethan's hands were steady on the controls as he piloted his ship through the smoke and fire, each shot he fired bringing them closer to victory. But it wasn't just the weapons that gave them an advantage. It was the spirit of humanity. The desire to survive, to protect their world, to protect each other. Ethan knew it wasn't just about winning. It was about proving to the Zarkans, and to the universe, that humanity would never bow down. No matter how technologically advanced the enemy, no matter how many sacrifices were made, humanity would rise. And they would rise together. As the last of the Zarkan ships fell from the sky, Ethan stood tall, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. This was just the beginning. The Empire had been defeated, but their influence was still widespread. Humanity had risen, but now it was time to rebuild. And with that thought, Ethan set his sights on the future. A future where humanity was no longer just fighting for survival. A future where they could thrive. And nothing would ever take that away from them.